All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first of two Zoom sessions for this class. I see that a majority of the class is here, so I'm sure others will be coming in along the way, but it's 6 o'clock, so to be respectful of your time, we'll go ahead and get started for this evening. I teach online a lot, but one of the things I have seen over my years teaching online is usually online sessions tend to work better when they're shorter as opposed to longer. And so I would assume we probably will spend less than 2 hours tonight in this session and then kind of return to our normal approach when we get together again on Thursday on campus. Just a reminder for everyone, you have the background paper that is due on Thursday by midnight. I think we've talked about that paper a lot, so everyone knows what you are doing for it. Very brief 3 to 5 page paper where you're introducing the issue or the problem that you're going to talk about that impacts effectiveness for the organization that you're discussing. As I've said many times throughout our course so far, you do not have to use your organization if you are not comfortable talking about your organization. You can always use an organization that you are familiar with or an organization you are interested in. But you'll be identifying what this issue or problem is that is inhibiting effectiveness, and then kind of educating me a little bit on that issue. Where that issue come from? Is it a new issue? Who's involved in the issue? Uh, have there been attempts in the past to try and resolve the issue? And if so, how successful have those previous attempts been? So very short 3 to 5 page background paper. So you have that due on Thursday. And then your next Canvas essay is due the following Monday on the 29th, I guess it would be. And in that essay, what you're doing is you're basically taking your background paper and you're distilling it into a couple of paragraphs where you present to your colleagues, here's the issue, here's the problem that you discussed in your background paper. So that Canvas essay should be relatively quick and easy to write because you're just distilling what you've already written in your background paper. Now, back to the background papers very quickly. As I said, they're due by midnight this Thursday. I tend to grade them very quickly, and so I will have a really quick turnaround on them. So if they come in by midnight on Thursday, if all goes well and nothing intervenes, and a lot of things have been intervening over the past week and a half, but I should be able to have grades back to you and feedback to you sometime on Friday. So I try and get them turned around within 24 hours. Okay, I think that's all the administrative issues that we need to talk about. I do want to remind you that tonight what we're going to do here online is we're going to talk about environmental analysis. We're going to talk about the impact that the external as well as the internal environment for organizations can have on organizational effectiveness. Then we get back together in 48 hours on campus on Thursday. We will talk about missions and goals, and we'll talk about the impact of mission statements and goals and strategic planning on the effectiveness of organizations. Have a breakout assignment that we'll do like we normally do when we're on campus. And then if time permits, once we're done with that breakout group on Thursday, then we will move into a discussion of the 4 different models of organizational effectiveness. I'll walk you through those 4 different models, kind of talk about how they relate to each other, how they sometimes overlap with each other, but to provide us a little bit more of a nuanced approach to how we measure that term that we'd like to refer to as effectiveness. But for tonight's class, I am going to turn off my camera if that's okay with everyone, because I am teaching from home tonight and I don't want to have any bandwidth issues. And it seems like when I turn my camera off, I don't have as many bandwidth issues as I usually do. So I'll have my camera off, not being rude or anything, but just to try and save on bandwidth and to help with our connectivity for the evening. I do encourage you to participate in our session tonight. And so I've got the text chat box open. I'll keep that open throughout the entire course tonight. And so as I ask you questions, feel free to answer those questions and participate. So it's not just kind of a one-way me sitting here talking to you for a couple hours who can actually have a little bit of a discussion. So what I would like to do tonight is in the very first part of class tonight, talk about the external environment of public and nonprofit organizations from the perspective of what does that environment mean for the effectiveness of the organization? How we measure, how we define, and how we achieve effectiveness. That shouldn't take us very long, but then after that, I'd like to turn our attention to the internal environment within those public and nonprofit organizations. And when we talk about the internal environment, we are going to, by necessity, turn our attention to looking at some of the organization theory literature. And I know you've covered some of this literature in the past in your time in the MPA program, but we are going to go back through some of that literature as it then instructs us in terms of the measurement of effectiveness inside of organizations. So external environment, followed then by a discussion of the internal environment. So when we talk about the external environment, there are several characteristics of the external environment that can have direct import for the effectiveness of an organization. And some of these are obviously very commonsensical, and you've probably talked about them in other contexts and other courses in the program. The first one is capacity. The capacity of the environment to support that organization. Organizations can only be effective if they are operating within an external environment that has the capacity and the willingness to support those organizations. So when you talk about environmental capacity, you talk about the capability of the environment to support the organization. One of the primary elements of capacity are the resources that exist within that external environment. So does the external environment have the requisite resources necessary to support the organization? And then sometimes even more importantly, does the environment then have the willingness to provide those resources to that organization to keep that organization going on a daily basis? So when we're looking at things like resources, there's abundance of resources in the environment, things such as obviously monetary resources. So we have some environments that provide resources through appropriations. And we've talked here and there in the past about the importance of relying upon appropriations in the public sector. When we rely upon appropriations, appropriations tend to be much more stable than getting money from profit as we would in the private sector. But if government agencies cannot count on those appropriations year in and year out, obviously there are going to be some questions about the ability or the willingness of the environment to support that organization. We know here in California, as well as in a lot of states around the country, we've seen revenues kind of trailing behind those forecasts that we had back in January and February. And as a result of that, here in California, we ended up getting a May revise that called for some spending freezes and called for some cuts in appropriations to various programs and various agencies around the state. More cuts you have, obviously, the less the capacity of the environment to support that organization. If you're in a nonprofit organization, a lot of your resources, at least your financial resources, are probably going to come from grants as opposed to appropriations. So the capacity of the environment might then be measured in terms of the number of organizations that provide grants to nonprofit organizations, the amount of those grants that are available. We do know that grants tend to be relatively transient. They tend to be relatively temporary. And you cannot necessarily, with 100% certainty, be sure that those grant proceeds are going to continue at the same level year after year after year. And so whenever those grant proceeds start to dry up, then you see a reduction in the capacity of the environment to support that nonprofit organizations. So fiscal resources, one indicator of capacity. Another indicator of capacity could be a well-trained available labor pool. So in organizations need to reach out into their environment to hire new employees. So does the environment have a labor pool that has the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the work of the organization? So if you don't have enough people to hire who have those skills, then there's going to be a problem with environmental capacity. The irony is, in very good economic times, and we saw this several years ago, that in very good economic times, sometimes the labor pool shrinks because there are enough jobs go around. People are applying to different organizations. They're leaving their job to go to different organizations, and then to fill those positions, we don't really have an adequate labor pool to reach out there into our environment to fill those positions. So the human side of the equation, do we have an adequate labor pool? You think about things such as political support as another element of the capacity of the external environment to support the organization. If you don't have political support on the part of budget makers, on the part of elected officials, then you're probably going to suffer from a lack of capacity in your environment. If you don't have the political support of client groups and constituent groups, then you're going to suffer from a lack of capacity on the part of the environment to support the organization. So sometimes organizations struggle and indeed even go out of existence, not necessarily because of how effectively they're doing their jobs as an organization, but sometimes they go out of existence because they don't have the requisite resources available to them in their external environment. So capacity is the first thing we look at with the external environment. Secondly, we look at homogeneity. And by homogeneity, we are looking at homogeneity of demands that are being placed upon the organization. The more homogeneous the demands placed upon an organization, the easier the work of the organization becomes. It becomes easier to satisfy those client groups and those constituent groups and those elected officials if you have very similar, very homogeneous demands being placed upon you. If you have a lot of heterogeneous demands, a lot of different demands that sometimes conflict with each other, that's going to make it more difficult for the organization, not only to survive, but more difficult for the organization to really be able to measure what it considers to be effective. Because meeting the wants, needs, and desires of one group may mean that you cannot meet the wants and needs of another group. So you're effective in meeting the needs of one client group, but you're not effective in meeting the needs of another client group. Stability versus turbulence in the environment. How stable is your environment? How turbulent is your environment? Going through COVID-19, obviously, we had a great deal of turbulence in external environments. There's a lot of uncertainty. We had a lot of organizations that had to move completely online and completely remote. And a lot of those organizations are still somewhat remote in terms of their operations. It's been more difficult than a lot of organizations thought to return to in-person physical types of office settings. So you had a lot of turbulence coming from COVID-19. The past week and a half in our political environment obviously has been one of the most turbulent week and a half that I've lived through in terms of our political environment. Whenever you have intervening elections, the result of an election certainly can introduce a lot of turbulence and a lack of stability into the environment. We have seen that especially recently with this, what the policymakers are referred to and policy analysts are referred to as the punctuated equilibrium approach to policymaking. And what we have seen is it seems like every time we have a new administration come in, that new administration then spends a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of focus trying to undo what the previous administration had done over its 4 years. Then whenever a new administration comes in, they will try and undo what that more recent administration has tried to do. And so that intervening election and the partisan differences that we see between the parties really does introduce a whole lot of turbulence into our environment. Turbulence is difficult for organizations, obviously, because it changes the types of demands that are being placed upon the organization. And organizations always have to recalibrate how to meet those new demands and obviously recalibrate what they are going to define as effective type of behavior. That turbulence also brings in a lot of questions in terms of the revenue that organizations will be receiving, a lot of questions in terms of staffing and how well they can staff and how many positions they can fill in their organizations. So you can kind of see all the impacts that turbulence has on the ability of an organization to measure and then achieve effectiveness. Stability, by contrast, obviously makes it easier for organizations to find a definition, settle on a definition of effectiveness, and then stick with that definition over a long period of time. Concentration and dispersion. And by concentration and dispersion, we are looking at concentration or dispersion of resources in the environment. So how concentrated are necessary resources in the environment as compared to how dispersed these resources are. Obviously, the more concentrated the resources are, the more organizations know exactly where to go for those resources, how to access those resources, how many of those resources the organization will need, how to get those organizations from those resources from those individuals and groups that are holding those resources. It's a much cleaner and much easier decision-making process when your resources are concentrated. So when you think about appropriations, those are usually very concentrated types of resources. So if you're a federal agency, you're getting your resources from Congress, it's a very concentrated source of resources. If you are a nonprofit organization and you're cobbling together a lot of different grant sources, then you've got a lot of dispersion in terms of the resources that you are trying to acquire. And on Thursday, if we have time, when we get into the systems resource model of organizational effectiveness, we will talk a lot about how we measure effectiveness by the ability of the organization to access and acquire these resources from its external environment. And so the mere process of acquiring resources from your environment can be an indicator of organizational effectiveness. And then consensus versus dissensus. So how much agreement, how much consensus do you have within your environment in terms of the purpose of the organization? Clearly, the more consensus, the easier it is for the organization to identify and measure effectiveness, as opposed to if you have a lot of disagreement over the purpose of the organization or the purpose and goals of a public policy or a public program. So when we look at our external environment, we have to look at those characteristics, but we also have to pay attention to the fact that there are a lot of political actors that we have to mollify in our external environment here in the public sector. And we've talked many times about the many masters theory of public administration. We serve a legislature, we serve an executive, we serve the judiciary, we serve other agencies in public administration, we serve interest groups, we have to be responsive to the mass media. Those are all the actors that we have to deal with in our external environment. And oftentimes, the way in which we deal with these actors tends to be very political in nature. So when we deal with legislative bodies, as we know, they have the oversight ability over agencies. So if you're a federal agency, your actions are overseen by Congress. If you're a state agency, your actions are overseen by ultimately the state legislature or even the governor, but we'll get to executive in a second. If you are a local organization, a local agency, then you are going to be held responsible to the legislative body at the local level, whether it be a board of supervisors at the county level, whether it be a city council at the city level, whether it be a school board, school district level. So we have to then be accountable to oversight to these legislative organizations. We know that there is kind of this tension whenever organizations are held accountable to legislative bodies through the oversight process. There is this tension known as the principal-agent relationship, which I know we have mentioned before, but let's kind of expand a little bit upon this principal-agent relationship. So when legislative bodies, from an external perspective, need to oversee the actions of agencies, the agencies tend to be the ones that have the information. So you would hope that in a principal-agent relationship where the legislative body is the principal and the agency is the agent, that the principal, the legislative body, would have the information necessary to conduct effective oversight over that agency. And I don't know if you've been watching the news, but I assume most people have because there's a lot been going on in the news lately. But one of the things that happened yesterday is that you had the director of the Secret Service who was testifying before Congress, and that was Congress exercising its oversight responsibility over the Secret Service. Whenever you have that federal agency that goes to participate in oversight with a legislative body, the fact of the matter is the agency tends to have the information, and it's a legislative body that's trying to extract that information from the agency in order to try and effectively conduct oversight. Now, you saw that in those hearings yesterday, and there's another set of hearings today as well, and the director of the Secret Service actually ended up resigning. But in those hearings, that's exactly what you saw. You saw members of Congress trying to get information from the Secret Service in terms of the incident that happened in Butler, Pennsylvania, with the attempted assassination of former President Trump. The problem you run into is when the agency has the information. So the Secret Service has the information in terms of what they did on that day, where they had their officers located, the movement of those officers, the decisions made by those officers. That's information that is possessed by the Secret Service. Congress wants that information. So Congress has to extract that information. The problem in the principal-agent relationship is because the agent has that information, the agent then needs to determine how much of that information to give to Congress and what type of information to give to Congress to allow Congress to do its oversight. There is obviously a natural tendency as a rational self-interest actor at an agency that if you provide all this information to Congress, you're making it easier for Congress to oversee you and scrutinize your actions. So in the principal-agent relationship, there is this natural problem that's known as a moral hazard. And the moral hazard speaks to this information asymmetry. So the moral hazard is for members of the agency. So it's when agency members need to decide what information and how much information to give to members of Congress, knowing that by giving that information, it's probably going to make the agency's job a little bit more difficult because it's going to invite even more scrutiny and even more oversight from the members of the legislative body. So you've got this dance that goes on between administrators in terms of in agencies versus elected officials in these legislative bodies. And oftentimes this relationship ends up becoming a very political type of a relationship. There is an incentive, though, for agencies to provide information to the legislature in terms of the anticipation of more appropriations in the future. So agencies know that if they play ball with Congress and if they participate openly and freely in this oversight process, then they will curry favor with members of Congress who are the budget makers, and therefore it may lead to more appropriations in the future. Building that trust between the agency and the overseers will hopefully then result in additional appropriations, which will then enhance the capacity of the external environment to support the operations of the organization. Then we also know, in addition to serving the legislature as members of agencies, we also then are located within the executive branch, which means that we then also need to serve the executive. We know that the problem is when we serve the executive, when we follow executive directives and executive edicts, those executive directives will sometimes run counter to the directives that we are being given by the legislature. And so sometimes you have to decide, do we follow the executive orders or do we follow the directives provided to us by the legislature? Executive directives, legislative prescriptions can certainly go in completely opposite directions, which then makes it difficult for the organization to define effectiveness. If you abide by the executive edicts, if that's your definition of effectiveness, then you're probably not going to be abiding by the direction that the legislature wants your agency to go in. We know that there's increasing oversight of federal agencies as well as state and local agencies from the judiciary. The judiciary as a reactive organization, we know that the judiciary tends to be rather reactive as opposed to proactive. The old adage is that cases find the courts don't go out there and find cases. But when cases do find the courts, members of the judiciary will certainly have a lot of tools at their disposal to prompt or to require action on the part of agencies and members of those agencies. They have tools such as consent decrees. And we have seen, for example, LAPD. LAPD for many years has been operating under a consent decree that was bestowed upon them by the judiciary. Structural remedies. It's another example of how the judiciary can then compel certain types of actions on the part of members of agencies and departments. So a structural remedy would be, for example, if someone brought a case against an agency saying that this agency was violating my constitutional rights in whatever manner, and the judiciary agreed that this action taken by the agency violated the constitutional rights of that individual, the judiciary could then issue a structural remedy whereby they could tell an agency, you must take this action in order to redress this complaint about the violation of constitutional rights. One very common policy area we've seen structural remedies used in is in terms of education funding. And there's a very famous case from the state of Missouri several years ago, where there was a district in Missouri that was sued for violating the fair and equivalent education provision in the Missouri State Constitution. And the Missouri State Constitution, like most state constitutions around the country, had a provision in there calling for fair and equivalent, I believe it was fair and equivalent K through 12 education across the entire state. Well, this district was spending substantially less per pupil than neighboring districts. And so the complaint was they are not providing an equivalent education to what students in these more affluent districts are getting. So what the state Supreme Court did in Missouri is they came back to that school district and said, you must spend more revenue per pupil so that you can be equivalent to your surrounding districts. And for every day that you do not pass a tax levy to generate more revenue, we are going to fine the school district each day that you fail to pass that tax levy. Well, that's a structural remedy. This is something you need to do to remedy the situation, this violation of the state constitution. What compounded the problem for this district in the state of Missouri is that Missouri has a provision in the Constitution that says that in order to pass a tax levy, you need to get at least a 2/3 majority vote from your voters. So you have to get at least 67% of voters. Well, every time they tried to pass a tax levy, they could barely get above 50% and nowhere near to that 67% threshold. The Supreme Court said, we don't care. You have to figure out a way to spend more money per pupil. We don't care that you are struggling under this limitation on your ability to raise revenue. That's an example of a structural remedy. For over 200 years in this country, dating all the way back to 1803 and Marbury versus Madison, there has been this device that the judiciary can use known as writs of mandamus. A writ of mandamus is when the judiciary orders administrative actor to take a certain type of action under civil or criminal penalties. It literally is an order that you must take this type of action. So those writs of mandamus, that again have been around since 1803, those are other devices that we see the judiciary using to compel action by administrators and administrative agencies. So obviously the judiciary has taken on a much more heightened and much more important role in overseeing the actions of public administrators. And I think I had introduced you to last time we were together, we talked about qualified good faith immunity and some of the changes in that recent Supreme Court case, Gonzalez versus Trevino, in that qualified good faith immunity and the amount of scrutiny that the judiciary is applying to the actions taken by individual administrators, especially if those actions are seen as violating the constitutional rights of citizens. Other agencies. We know that it is relatively unusual today for a singular program to be administered by one singular agency at one singular level of government. It's much more likely that our public programs and our public policies are being administered through these networks of agencies, whether they be networks of agencies at the local level or intergovernmental networks between the national, state, and local agencies. You've got a lot of these networks that are responsible for implementing policies and programs. So you have to have this interaction with other agencies, not just at your level of government, but across our levels of intergovernmental relations. Interest groups obviously also have something to say about what administrators do and how we define and measure effectiveness in our organizations. We know, as we talked about last week, that we end up with a lot of vague pieces of legislation that come to us from legislatures, because in order to pass it, you have to have all those details kind of left out of that legislation, and then those details figured out later on. Those details then get figured out later on through the administrative rulemaking process, and interest groups are smart. So interest groups know not only can they lobby the legislature when these pieces of legislation are being considered in Congress or a state legislature, but they also know that they can bring their resources to bear on the rulemaking process as well. A lot of these substantive decisions about exactly how programs and policies will be implemented, those decisions are made at the agency level through the rulemaking process, and interest groups have become very involved in trying to influence that rulemaking process. We know through the administrative rulemaking process, we have to put forth a notice whenever rules are going to be written or rules are going to be changed, and then we have to provide for public hearings. Well, in those public hearings, oftentimes those interest groups can then attend those public hearings and speak at those public hearings to try and lobby and negotiate changes to those rules. So we have this direct interplay, this direct relationship with interest groups as well. And then obviously the mass media. Mass media have the role of watching what goes on in agencies, watching the actions of administrators. And so that scrutiny also then means we have to have these relationships and hopefully supportive relationships with members of the mass media. And we talked last time about all these public records requests that we not only get from citizens, but also from media outlets. So we have all these political actors who are also involved in our external environment, which really does underscore that the primary difference between the external environment in the public sector versus the private sector, that primary difference is the heterogeneity and the variation, the variety in the actors that are involved in the external environment here in the public sector. So how we define effectiveness in our organization will be influenced not only by the characteristics we talked about in the previous slide, but also by our interactions with all these different actors who are involved in our external environment as well. I think that when you look at the literature in public administration over the past 150 years, I think that what we're really struck by is that the primary focus of public administration literature tends to not be on the external environment as much as it is on the internal environment. Most of the focus of public administration theorists has been within organizations, looking at how organizations structure themselves, looking at how organizations engage in planning, looking at how organizations engage in the process of work. And the focus has been much more internal as opposed to external in nature. And if you've had an organization theory course, that's probably something that became very clear to you very quickly as you went through the evolution and development of the literature on organizations. But at the end of the day, in organization theory literature, the primary goal of most of our organization theorists has been organizational effectiveness. How can we work within the organization and change the internal dynamics and the internal components inside our organizations to try and better achieve effectiveness for the organization? So at this point, I'd like to talk about this more internal focus and kind of do a review of the organization theory literature and what the different schools of thought in organization theory have told us about how we define and measure effectiveness within our organizations. And again, recognizing that you've kind of been through a lot of these schools and a lot of these theorists before. If you've looked, there are 68 slides here. We're not going to go through all 68 of those slides. I think we can go through it much more quickly than that because you've probably been exposed to a lot of these schools of thought and a lot of these theorists before. But when you have talked about organization theory previously in the program, hopefully you've had the opportunity to kind of take an overview of how our approach to study organizations, how those approaches have changed since the late 1800s. And we have about 150 years of organization theory literature that we can draw upon for this discussion of the impact of the internal environment on organizational effectiveness. And where we typically start when we talk about the evolution of organization theory is usually with what we call the classical school of organization theory. And in the classical school of organization theory, what kind of ties all of those theorists together in the classical school is really their focus not only on how to achieve effectiveness in the organization, but very much a focus on a one-size-fits-all approach. And you know, because my favorite answer to everything is it depends, one-size-fits-all approach is very much antithetical to the way in which I look at public administration. But for the classical theorists, they really did believe that they could come up with this magic bullet. They could come up with this panacea, this one-size-fits-all approach that if we apply to all of our organizations, this one approach will then make all of our organizations effective. So whenever you started talking about classic organization theory, one of the first people you probably started talking about was our good friend Max Weber. And Max Weber, writing in the late 1800s, had his own specific view of bureaucratic organizations and how to make those organizations effective. So based upon what you remember about Max Weber from previous courses, can someone tell me about Max Weber? Give me a little synopsis of what Max Weber's theories were. Anybody remember Max Weber and his ideal bureaucracy? Yeah, Max Weber was a very big believer in organizations. He was a very big believer in the idea of a bureaucracy. He felt that a bureaucratic organization was the highest level of rationalization. It was the highest level of rationality that we could get. Weber very much believed in empiricism. He very much believed that we could develop information, collect information, analyze that information, and then apply that information to make rational decisions. He really believed in empiricism as opposed to just having faith in something. So he said we need to be able to go out there and empirically collect tangible information. You know, when we talk about empirical evidence, we are talking about tangible evidence, evidence that can be acquired, that can be sensed, that can be measured, and then used to arrive at these rational types of decisions. So for Max Weber, his primary theory was this idea of the ideal bureaucracy, to create the ideal bureaucratic organization. And for Max Weber, the ideal bureaucratic organization was an organization that was structured with all these different elements that I'm sure you've learned about before in the program, things like a division of labor. Then we have a large organization, we have all these different jobs that need to be done. we divide those jobs up. We divide the labor up among all the people within the organization. So our ideal bureaucratic structure should be one of a division of labor. That division of labor then leads us to task specialization. When we divide the work up among all these people in our organization, each individual employee then starts to specialize in a certain type of a task. So we have task specialization. When people specialize in certain types of tasks, they then become experts in those tasks because they are doing those jobs every single day, day in and day out. They become the experts on the jobs that they are doing. The structure of our organization should be a tall hierarchy, this pyramidal shape that I'm sure you're very familiar with, where you have a singular director or head of the organization. Then as you go down the organization chart, you then encounter more and more positions so that at the bottom level of your organization, that's where the plurality of positions in the organization reside. So it's very much this pyramidal, tall type of hierarchy. And in that tall hierarchy, it's a very centralized power structure. So orders, power will be handed down from upper levels down to lower levels in the organization structure. In this tall hierarchy, in this tall organization structure, you have people who know to whom they are responsible. So you know who your supervisors are. Your supervisors then have what's called a limited span of control, in that those supervisors are only accountable for a certain number of employees who are located beneath them in that organizational chart. It's kind of what's known as a unity of command, what's called a scalar chain, and that everyone knows to whom they are accountable. We also know these professional administrators who are there for a career, who are experts, they also make decisions based upon written rules and regulations. So the organization is bound by adherence to rules and policies and procedures, and these rules and policies and procedures are written down. And the advantage of relying upon written documentation is that by relying upon those written rules, everyone can then be treated in a fair and equal manner. So you don't have arbitrary or capricious decisions being made when you're dealing with members of the public. All members of the public are still accountable for all the same rules. And so everyone is held to all the same rules that everyone else is being held to. So it's a very structured, a very regimental type of structure to this ideal bureaucratic organization. Well, you know, my favorite question is so what? Well, so what? The so what here for Max Weber and his ideal bureaucracy is the way to achieve effectiveness is through this very tall hierarchical structure for your organization. So Weber believed that we could study organizations and study their structures. And if we could structure our organizations in this ideal bureaucratic model, that's how we can make all of our organizations effective. So effectiveness was really predicated upon the structure of the organization with Weber, and it was very much of a one-size-fits-all approach that all organizations could be effective if they followed this organizational structure. In Weber's ideal bureaucracy and his focus on effectiveness, to achieve effectiveness through this ideal bureaucratic structure, we would emphasize control. It would be very much of a centralized, top-down type of control situation, where our internal processes would be controlled from the top down through direct supervision and standardization. And in order to get our employees to do what they are told to do, we would then hold them accountable through a process known as legal compliance. Here are the rules, here are the policies and procedures. We will hold you accountable to adhering to those rules, policies, and procedures. If you do not follow these rules and these policies, then there will be punitive measures that will then be applied to you. You'll be removed from the organization. You'll be fired from your job. You'll be demoted to a lower level position. There are negative consequences for not adhering to these policies, these rules, and these procedures. So it's a very tightly structured, top-down, centralized approach to achieving effectiveness within our organizations. Now, chances are you probably see a lot of Max Weber's ideal bureaucratic elements within your organization. Most of our organizations in the public sector, we have organization charts. Those organization charts spell out pretty clearly to whom everyone is responsible. There's very much this unity of command, this scalar chain, this tall hierarchy. Your organization probably has policy and procedure manuals that you have to follow. So even though this is a classical approach, we still see a whole lot of Max Weber's ideal bureaucracy in our modern day organizations. But we also need to recognize the limitations that are associated with Weber's ideal bureaucracy. He focused on structure. For him, individual employees were not very important. He didn't distinguish between different employees. Employees were in their position in that organization chart. They had to do their jobs following those rules and those processes. There wasn't a whole lot of flexibility. It certainly wasn't seen as a social type of organization. It was a very structured, very regimented structure for our organizations to achieve effectiveness. And this lack of recognition of the value, if you will, of individual employees was one of the primary drawbacks of Weberian literature, and was one of the reasons why we saw a lot of more recent authors take issue with Max Weber and his idea of an ideal bureaucracy. But that's Max Weber and his ideal bureaucracy. Another classical author whose theories we see alive and well in a lot of our contemporary organizations is our good friend Frederick Taylor. And I'm sure you've learned and heard a lot about Frederick Taylor and his scientific management approach. Frederick Taylor believed that we needed a science of management. And the reason why he thought we needed a science of management to make our organizations effective is that he was very much a product of his time. And when you think about when Frederick Taylor was developing his scientific management theory, when Frederick Taylor was doing his research and his writing, we were talking about the early 1900s. And in the early 1900s, we had a lot of labor unrest in our factories and our places of work. We had books like, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. And we had a lot of coverage of some of these dehumanizing types of situations within our organizations, which led to a lot of this labor unrest. Taylor wasn't all that concerned about the dehumanizing aspect of it. He was concerned about the labor unrest, because that labor unrest meant that it was difficult, if not impossible, for the organization to operate efficiently and effectively. So his primary goal was, let's make the organization more efficient and more effective. He also recognized, when he looked at organizations in the early 1900s, that there was very much of a void, if you will, between upper level management and lower level employees. We didn't really have the level of middle managers that we have in today's modern organizations. Because we didn't have those middle managers, there was very little direct supervision and direct guidance being provided to employees. So employees were not doing their jobs efficiently, and that was leading to a lack of effectiveness for the organization. So as you probably know, in scientific management, what Taylor wanted to focus on is he wanted to focus on the process of work itself. He felt that people did not have standards for performance, and they were not being held accountable to meeting performance standards. So as a result, people were engaging in what he referred to as soldiering. Soldiering was a process by which people would do as little as they possibly could do in order to get by on a daily basis. They're doing as little as they could do, and they didn't have a performance standard to live up to. Obviously, you're going to have problems with organizational effectiveness. So what Taylor wanted to do is he wanted to take each individual job and deconstruct each individual job to understand the one best way to do a job. So he did his time motion studies that you've probably read about before, where he would literally stand there with a stopwatch and would time every single movement taken by an individual employee. So the classic example, the very simple example, was shoveling pig ore. So he would watch somebody take the shovel, put the shovel into the pig ore, how long it took him to put the shovel in, how long it took him to pick up a shovel full of pig ore, how long it took him to take that shovel full over to the cart, how long it took him to dump it into the cart, how long it took him to go back to the original pile and start the process over again. He would time each one of those movements, and the idea being that all what he would call the true movements, the movements that were efficient and effective for getting the job done, all those effective movements would then be combined together into what he said was the one best way to do the job. Any movement that did not contribute to the efficiency or the effectiveness of doing a job, all those false movements were then eliminated. So you eliminate the false movements, you combine all the true movements together, you come up with the one best way to do the job. You're basically systematizing that job. Once you know the one best way to do the job, then you know the characteristics to look for when you hire an employee to do that job. So we'll hire people who have the characteristics necessary to do the job in that one best way. We'll provide them with the tools that they need to do that job in the one best way. And we will then reward those employees for achieving performance standards. So we'll establish performance standards for these employees. We will then provide them with bonus pay, with rewards for achieving those performance standards. We're standardizing, we're systematizing all the processes that go on within our organization. And by doing so, we then can make our organizations both efficient as well as effective. Frederick Taylor's scientific management was very popular in the private sector in the early 1900s and into the 1920s. So popular and so successful that it was then adopted in the public sector. And when the public sector adopted scientific management, it had a little bit less success than in the private sector because there are some real limitations with Frederick Taylor and scientific management. If you read any of Taylor's original work, you'll see that Taylor had a very dehumanizing perspective on individual human beings. He referred to human beings, to workers, as being what he called boorish beasts. He said that they were merely cogs in the machinery of the organization. So when you think about a machine and you think about all the different cogs in the machine, you can picture a cog. That cog has all these teeth on it. And so when that cog turns, the teeth on that cog will then make contact with the teeth on another cog that makes that cog turn, that then makes contact with the teeth on another cog that makes that cog turn. And that's what makes the machinery of the organization work. If one of those cogs has a tooth broken off, it will no longer then make contact with another cog, and the entire machinery then grinds to a screeching halt. So for Taylor, if people are cogs in the machinery, if you have a broken cog, you take out that broken cog, you throw it away, you replace it with a new cog, and the machinery of the organization then starts to operate again. If you have an employee who is not doing their job, rather than training that person, rather than consulting with that person and providing them with the skills they need, you just remove that person, you throw them out of the organization, you replace them with someone who does have the requisite skills to do the job. So it's a very dehumanizing approach to individual employees. The importance, though, here of Taylor in this classical school is that he has a similarity to Weber in that both Taylor as well as Weber are taking this one-size-fits-all approach to organizational efficiency and effectiveness. The difference is that Weber focused on the structure of the organization. Taylor focused on the work process itself. If we can standardize and systematize the work process, hold people accountable for doing the work in the way in which they're supposed to do it, reward them for doing it in that one best way, That's how we can make our organizations efficient and effective. But again, Weber and Taylor really didn't pay a whole lot of attention to the importance of the human aspect and the social aspect of these organizations. So Weber looked at structure, Taylor looked very much at work processes. But the major criticism, again, of scientific management is how dehumanizing it was and how it didn't look at individual differences between employees and didn't really recognize at all the social aspect of an organization. With Taylor and his scientific management approach to achieve organizational effectiveness, we emphasize this internal process. We go and deconstruct and systematize the internal processes within the organization. Our ultimate goal is effectiveness, but we achieve that effectiveness through this systemizing and this standardization. We hold people accountable for their performance within the organization through giving them rewards if they accomplish performance standards, and then essentially getting rid of them if they do not accomplish those performance standards. Legal compliance, these punitive measures for not achieving your level of performance you should be achieving. Then, if you remember from any previous courses in the classical school, there's another aspect of the classical school that's known as the principal school. And the principal school I usually like to talk about as a classical approach, because in the principal school, we are again not really placing a lot of emphasis on valuing individual employees. The ultimate goal of the principles theorist is still organizational effectiveness. Effectiveness is still being measured as how well is the organization achieving its goal. Weber said you can achieve your goal through structure. Taylor said you can achieve your goal through systematizing work processes. Here in the principles school, the principles theorists say you can achieve your goal as an organization through really focusing on the tools of management that you can provide to your managers. That if we could teach our managers how to manage, that is what will help make our organizations effective, help our organizations achieve their stated goals. One of those principles theorists is someone by the name of Henri Fayol. And Fayol made kind of an interesting argument to us in that if we wanted to make our organizations effective, we needed to view effectiveness through the framework of what he called organizational governance. We had to look at all the aspects of how we govern the organization. It wasn't just all about management. It was about governing the organization. According to Fayol, management is only one aspect of the governance of an organization. According to Fayol, governance not only includes management, it also includes engaging in technical activities, engaging in commercial activities, engaging in financial activities, engaging in security activities, and engaging in accounting activities. So what's he mean by all of those? Technical activities. In order to be effective as an organization and effectively govern an organization, managers need to do a good job of managing the technical aspects of how work is being done on a daily basis. So essentially what organizations do is they receive these inputs, they receive these resources in terms of money, and they then use those resources and transform those inputs into outputs using technology, using technical expertise. So in order to be effective, we need to effectively manage all those technical activities that go into the creation of the goods and services that we're creating on a daily basis. We also have to do a good job of managing our commercial activities. Commercial activities speak to the relationships between the organization and the market, or between the organization and other agencies in its environment. So the transactions in terms of time and money and personnel that will go on between the organization and all those other organizations and aspects in its external environment, those transactions are commercial activities that the organization has to engage in. The organization also has to engage in financial activities. We know that money is the lifeblood of any organization. So we have to do a good job of managing our finances, our resources, and how we spend those resources. We also have to do a good job of managing our security activities. We have to make sure that our employees are safe and secure. We have to make sure that any type of intellectual property that we are creating as an organization is safe and secure as well. And we have to engage in accounting activities. And this is especially true for public organizations. When you are spending public taxpayer money, you have to account for how that money is being spent. You engage in doing your audits on an annual basis, sometimes 2 times a year, depending upon the types of funds you are auditing. You engage in these accounting types of activities. All those good things you do in accounting, like double entry accounting and fund-based accounting, those are activities that also have to be managed within the governance of an organization. So what this all leads Fail to is it leads Fail to his principles school of management. So in order to be effective as an organization, according to Fail, organizations must adhere to the following principles. And some of these are very similar to what we've already talked about with Max Weber, things like division of work. We have to divide up the work between members of our organization. Another principle of management that will lead to effectiveness in an organization is delegating authority. So if we delegate authority effectively by giving people authority over certain types of tasks and certain types of jobs, you create responsibility. Because once you make someone give someone authority over something, they then become responsible for that. Discipline. You have to have a system of discipline within the organization so that you can keep people in line and make sure that people are doing what they are supposed to be doing on a daily basis. You need to have this unity of command that Max Weber talked to us about. You need to have the scalar chain where everyone knows to whom they are responsible. You need to have a subordination to the general interest. You need to have a system in place whereby people will focus more on the general interests of the organization as opposed to their individual, personal, private interest. You need to have a system of remuneration. So when people are achieving their performance standards, they need to know that they will be compensated for achieving those performance standards. Power needs to be centralized. You need to have centralized power, much like in Max Weber's tall hierarchy. You need to have this scalar chain, this chain of command. You need to have order in the daily operations of the organization. You need to treat employees equitably. By treating employees equitably, if they feel they're being treated fairly, then they are more willing to give back to the organization and to provide contributions to the organization that will then make the organization effective. You need to have stability of personnel. If you have a lot of employee turnover, I know I've spoken to several people about the issue, the problem that they're going to talk about in their background paper, and some people are looking at employee retention, high levels of employee turnover. We know the more turnover you have, the more costs that are associated with that. There are costs associated with going out there and recruiting people, with selecting people, with then onboarding people and training people, and the costs are sometimes astronomical. So you need to have stable personnel. You need to reward initiative. You need to provide people with monetary rewards for taking initiative and being creative. And you need to try and create an esprit de corps within an organization for it to be effective. And this esprit de corps is essentially just a feeling that everyone in the organization, we are all in this together. We are working toward the same goals. We are all here trying to accomplish the same thing. The more feeling of esprit de corps, the more feeling of teamwork that you have, the more likely it is that your organization will achieve its goals and then be therefore effective. But probably the more prominent principle theorist that will be covered in most MPA programs is our good friend Luther Gulick. And you've probably read Luther Gulick before in some of your previous courses. Luther Gulick is kind of your classical public administration theorist because Luther Gulick was kind of one of our first public administration theorists to take his theories and then be able to apply them directly to the public sector. If you remember anything about the development of the federal bureaucracy, you know that as a response to the Great Depression, FDR created his New Deal programs. And when FDR created his New Deal programs, it led to a great explosion in the size of the federal bureaucracy. We had the creation of all these different programs and all these what were called alphabet agencies that were being created. The federal bureaucracy became so big that it was impossible for a singular president to effectively manage this ever-increasing federal bureaucracy. So we ended up having this thing known as the Brownlow Commission. And the Brownlow Commission was charged with coming up with a reorganization plan to reorganize the federal bureaucracy to make it easier for presidents to manage this ever-increasing size of the federal bureaucracy. Well, why is that important for Luther Gulick? It's important because Luther Gulick was a member of the Brownlow Commission. So he was able to take a lot of his theories and incorporate them into this reorganization plan that then led to a reorganization of the federal bureaucracy. It gave us this executive office of the president. It placed all these overhead agencies within the executive office of the president. It really did provide a complete overhaul of the structure of the federal bureaucracy. So that's why we say Luther Gulick is kind of like our first public administration theorist who really used the federal bureaucracy as kind of a laboratory for a lot of his theories. But one of the theories that Gulick is best known for is his principal school. As you know, the POSCORP school: planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. All managers, according to Gulick, engage in planning. They have to plan the operations of their organization. They all engage in organizing. You have to organize labor. You have to organize resources within your organization. All effective managers have to engage in staffing, bringing in new employees who have the requisite skills and abilities to do the job. All effective managers have to engage in directing the actions of their employees. All effective managers have to engage in coordinating the efforts across the entire organization. All effective managers have to engage in reporting so we know how well we are achieving those goals that we are trying to achieve, especially if that's how we're measuring effectiveness. All effective managers have to engage in budgeting. They have to be able to bring resources into their organization and then be able to manage those resources effectively. So POSCORP, planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting, those are kind of your generic management tools that every manager needs to have in order to be effective and in order to make their organizations effective organizations. You can look at these tools as basically being a managerial toolkit. So the idea is that you give managers, equip them with these tools, and then depending upon the situation the manager finds themselves in, they will then reach into the managerial toolbox and they'll bring out the appropriate tool. So at certain points in time, you have to be a planner. Other points in time, you have to be a director. Other points in time, you have to coordinate. Other points in time, you have to manage budgets, and so on and so on. So for Gulick, in order to be effective organizations, we had to have managers who knew how to use these management tools. So essentially, by providing them with these tools, we make effective managers. And by making effective managers, we can then make effective organizations. Now, not everyone bought into the principal school. And there are some notable critiques of the principal school, notably Herb Simon and Dwight Waldo, two very famous public administration theorists who were famous for a variety of reasons, but they also became famous by critiquing the principal's approach to organization theory. Simon's critique of the principal school is that he, in a very derisive manner, referred to the principal school as the proverb school. And his argument was that for every one of these principles, you can find a countervailing opposite principle. That just like for any proverb, you can find a proverb that says something else. For any one of these principles, you can find a principle that says something else. These principles oftentimes can contradict with each other, thus making it difficult to say that this is the universal toolkit that every manager needs to have. Dwight Waldo's criticism of the principle school is that he referred to them as being prescriptions as opposed to principles. He said that these quote unquote principles, and usually put principles in quotes, but these quote unquote principles, they are not scientific and they are actually value-laden prescriptions. Value-laden prescriptions that emphasize the values of executive control and centralization. In essence, Dwight Waldo criticized the principal school as being a vehicle for centralizing power in our organizations and then exercising undue control over the employees who work within those organizations. So even though the principal school really had a big impact upon the restructuring of the federal bureaucracy in 1937, it did have a lot of criticisms. It did have a lot of critics. And kind of for those reasons, we saw the principal school kind of fall out of favor in favor of a new school of thought known as the human relations school. But before we move into the human relations school and what it means for effectiveness, just kind of recap this classical school of Weber, Taylor, Fayol, and Gulick. All those authors shared a singular focus on the effectiveness of the organization. It's just the way in which they achieved that effectiveness differed. For Weber, it was through structure. For Taylor, it was achieved through standardizing work processes. For Fayol and for Gulick, it was by coming up with these universal principles that could be taught to all of our managers. And by making our managers effective, we could then make our organizations effective as well. What really also kind of tied these classical theorists together was their almost complete disregard for the value of individual human beings, individual employees. That was a clear, notable flaw of scientific management, but was also a flaw of all the classical theorists. So because of that kind of dehumanizing approach to individual employees, we saw another school of thought grow up known as the human relations school. And one of the things that we see throughout the evolution of organization theory is that every new school comes about as a rejoinder or a response to the school that preceded it. So the human relations school grows up around all these criticisms of the classical school. We'll see later on the human resource management school comes about as a response to some of the flaws associated with the human relations school. But in the human relations school, human relations theorists believe that in order to make our organizations effective, we had to pay attention to individual employees. We paid attention to individual employees. We listened to individual employees. We recognized the social aspects of our organizations in order to make our organizations more effective, in order to be able to extract contributions from these employees to then help us achieve the goals of our organization. So when we're looking at the human relations school, we're looking primarily at the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, but there was an author that kind of predated the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and that was one of my favorite authors, Mary Parker Follett. Now, a lot of people, when they talk about the human relations approach to organizational effectiveness, and they talk about Mary Parker Follett, they will talk about her as kind of being a pre-human relations theorist. And the reason for that is that Mary Parker Follett was writing at the same time as scientific management was really gaining a foothold across the private as well as the public sector. Mary Parker Follett was kind of this lone voice in the wilderness in the 1920s, who was willing to point out all the flaws with scientific management in this classical approach to organizational effectiveness, at the same time that everyone else, or a vast majority of people, were buying into scientific management. So she really did kind of have the courage to stand up and take issue with one of the prevailing managerial schools at the time. So Mary Parker Follett, unfortunately for her writing as a woman in the 1920s, a lot of her male contemporaries didn't pay any attention to what she was writing. But some of the theories that she's developing as early as the 19 teens and the 1920s were the same theories that a lot of her male counterparts in the 1940s and 50s developed on their own. They just developed them 20, 30 years after Mary Parker Follett did. Mary Parker Follett, in talking about effective organizations, makes the argument that an effective organization is essentially what she calls a democratic organization. In order to make our organizations effective and to help us better achieve our goals, we need to make our organizations more democratic. We need to encourage participation on the part of our employees. So Follett argues that a democratic organization is going to be more likely to be effective than a non-democratic organization. And if you look across all the classical theorists, they argue for organizations that were very top-down, very controlled, almost dictatorial in terms of the way in which they were run. Follett completely parts company with that and says, no, effective organizations need to be more democratic in nature. But she also recognizes that there are some flaws in our system of representative democracy. So if we're going to make our organizations democratic, we have to recognize that our democratic organizations are going to suffer from the same types of flaws that our democratic system of governance may suffer from. And she says in a representative democracy like we have in this country, there are two fundamental flaws of a representative democracy. One fundamental flaw is particularized interest, and the second one is passivity of citizens. So in terms of particularized interest, Mary Parker Follett really does harken back to some of the founders, some of the framers of the Constitution, most notably James Madison. If you remember back to your American government courses and when you read the Federalist Papers, one of those Federalist Papers that you probably read was Federalist Paper number 10. And in Federalist Paper number 10, Madison warns us about the negative impact of factions. He says, whenever we have a compound republic, like what the framers were creating, we are going to have a situation where we have different groups of people who have different interests, and they have their own particularized interests, and the interests of one group may certainly come into conflict with the interests of another group. Conflict between these particularized interests, what Madison called these factions, is inevitable in a democracy. So what Madison argued is, in order to deal with the impact of these factions in a compound republic, we could either eliminate factions or we could go ahead and control their effects. He says that first option of eliminating factions is impossible. Because if you get rid of factions, if you get rid of these particularized interests, you require that everyone has the same opinion and the same thoughts, you are eliminating democracy. And it's a democracy no more. So you cannot get rid of factions. However, what you can do is you can control their effects by balancing faction against faction and finding a way to resolve these conflicts in a reasonable and productive manner. So Follett agrees with Madison that in a democratic organization, just like in democratic society, we are going to have these particularized interests that will create conflict. We need to come up with a way to deal with that conflict. Then the second problem in a democracy is passive citizens. And I think she's very correct about this. If you think about how people participate in their own governance, the primary way that we participate in governance is we vote. We go out there to the ballot box, or here in California now, we get ballots mailed to us, and we can fill out our ballot and drop it in the mailbox, or we could drop it in a vote ballot collection box. We can drop it at our voting place, but we don't necessarily have to go out and vote. We can vote from kind of the comfort of our own homes. So that's a very passive way of participating. People tend to participate in those passive ways as opposed to running for office or working on a campaign or giving money to a candidate or to a political party or even engaging in political discourse. Those are all more cost-intensive and resource-intensive ways of participating. If you assume that voters and members of citizens tend to be rational, self-interested actors, they're going to want to maximize their benefits while minimizing their costs. Well, what better way to maximize your benefits and minimize your costs than by taking a very passive route to participation, such as voting? So we kind of trend toward passivity on the part of our citizens. Follett says in a democratic organization, we are going to have a similar problem in that our employees are going to trend more toward passivity. So what we need to do is we need to provide them avenues for participation and incentivize their participation in the decision-making process. So what Follett says is in a democratic organization, number one, we have to deal with conflict. We know we have all these particularized interests. We know that when one interest comes into conflict with another interest, we're going to have an issue. So conflict is inevitable in a democratic organization. What is important is how we deal with that conflict. And she says there are three ways to deal with conflict. One way to deal with conflict is domination. One party wins, one party loses. This group wins, this group loses, conflict is resolved. That is the worst way to deal with conflict, because with that party that loses, that group that loses, obviously they're going to be disappointed, they're going to be disaffected, and they are not really going to be bought in on what the organization is doing moving forward. So she wants to avoid domination. She says the second approach is negotiation and compromise, which is better than domination, but still not ideal. In negotiation and compromise, both parties in the conflict will give something up. I give something up, you give something up, and we can come to a negotiated settlement. Better than domination, but because both parties are compromising and giving something up, neither party will be completely satisfied with the outcome of that conflict. The most appropriate way to deal with conflict is through what she calls integration. Integration occurs through this process known as the interpenetration of ideas. So we foster participation when we allow people to communicate with each other. We allow people to share ideas with each other. As ideas get shared, you get this interpenetration of ideas from one person to another, which then allows us to then integrate all those ideas to synthesize them into a new way of addressing that problem. Since everyone has contributed to that synthesis of that new idea, everyone then has a stake in the game, if you will. Everyone has a vested interest, and so everyone is more likely to then support that new idea that we are using to solve the problem. So she says, by far, interpenetration of ideas that leads to integration is the most appropriate way to deal with conflict in these types of democratic organizations. She also says in a democratic organization, we deal with power differently than we would in a classical organization. In a classical organization, the power relationship between leaders and employees was a power over relationship. Follett argues in a democratic organization, it should be more of a power with relationship. And the difference there for Follett is that power is a resource to help be developed among employees as opposed to be a resource that is given to employees. So in other words, what Follett is telling us is that if we can work with our employees to develop their resources and teach them how to use those resources, that's the way power should be exercised, as opposed to the centralized, control, top-down approach used by the classical theorists. And by helping our employees develop their own resources, that is what's going to help our organizations be more effective. This entire idea of a democratic organization is very much predicated upon participation, allowing people, affording people opportunities to participate in decision-making, to participate in their own self-governance. By allowing them to participate in their own decision-making, their own self-governance, you then have coordination through integration. People can then coordinate, they can communicate with each other, which then leads to this integration of ideas between individuals, as well as between departments, as well as between individuals and their departments. This type of fostering of participation needs to happen very early on in the organization. It is a gradual process. It's not something that's going to occur overnight. And we also have to recognize that this type of coordination, this type of participation is dynamic in nature. It's going to change over time. It's also going to change according to the situation. Follett was a big believer in situational leadership, in that the way in which we get people working together and get people to participate, the strategies we use will differ depending upon the situation that we are facing. For Follett, her democratic organization was very much predicated upon a human relations type of approach, working with individual employees, allowing them to participate in the processes going on within the organization. However, the ultimate goal of this participation was still to make the organization effective, to help the organization achieve its overall goals. So one similarity between Mary Parker Follett and the classical theorists is they are still defining effectiveness at the organizational level. It's all about helping the organization achieve its organizational goals. But you can see with Mary Parker Follett, a lot of her writings, again, the early 1900s, at least from a theoretical perspective, she's starting to pull us away from the classical school and moving us more toward a human relations approach, where we recognize that making our organizations effective will be based upon paying attention to our individual employees and allowing those individual employees opportunities to participate in their own governance. Very much of a participative management type of approach to a democratic organization. When you talked in previous courses about the Human Relations School of Organization Theory, I'm sure you talked about our good friend Elton Mayo. Elton Mayo is perhaps the most famous human relations theorist in the field of public administration. Elton Mayo kind of took a, well, not kind of, he did take a psychological approach to trying to understand how to make our organizations more effective. Mayo, from a psychological perspective, made the argument that at the time when he was writing, there was a lot of what he called social disorganization going on within our organizations. And he said that social disorganization came from a couple of different sources. One source of this disorganization was the nature of the factory system itself. That most of our organizations at this time in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, most of our organizations were very industrial in nature. They were very factory oriented, kind of what we'd refer to as a log link technology, meaning that we had this assembly line type of technology, whereby one person would do their job and then the next person do their job, the next person do their job, and so on and so on. So people were kind of balkanized into their own little niche, balkanized into their own little job, and they really didn't have a lot of opportunities to interact with each other. But he also said the problem stemmed from what he called human irrationality. He said, if you think about the results of the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Revolution led to the rise of all of these industries, especially in northern, what we would call today, Rust Belt cities. And so, in the Pittsburghs and the New Yorks and the Clevelands and the Chicagos and the Detroits, you had this rise of industrialization and all these factories that were being built. At the same time, you had the agrarian type of perspective in the South, these farms, these family farms that were going out of business. They weren't able to support themselves anymore. People were losing their farms. And as a result of that, young people in these families, these 14, 15, 16-year-olds, they didn't have any place to work because the farm was going out of business. So they then moved north into these industrial centers and they started working in these factories. But when they started working in these factories at these very young ages of 14, 15, 16 years old, they had moved out of the nuclear family at such an early age that Mayo argues they didn't have a chance to kind of work through all these psychological conflicts with their family that they would have been able to work through if they would have stayed there into their teen years and later on their teen years. So they were coming into these factories with what he called this human irrationality, and they were being placed in these factory types of systems that didn't provide them with a lot of opportunities to engage productively with their coworkers and their colleagues. So Mayo, being a good social scientist, decided that he was going to go out there and do field experiments to kind of test his theories and his hypotheses. The one experiment that he did that became so popular that we talked about it all the time in public administration was the Hawthorne experiments. Anybody familiar with or remember the Hawthorne experiments and what they were all about? There's a reason why they were called the Hawthorne experiments. Anybody remember that from a previous course? You may have even talked about this in a psychology course you had at the undergraduate level, because this is kind of a staple of basic psychology. The Hawthorne experiments conducted at this plant known as the Hawthorne electrical plant. And so what Mayo and his colleagues want to do is they want to go into this Hawthorne electrical plant, and they want to see what is the impact on changing a physical stimulus on the productivity of employees. So if we change this physical stimulus, what impact will that have on employee productivity? So the physical stimulus that they want to change, they want to change the lighting level in that plant. So the first hypothesis was a very simple one. If we turn the lighting level up, people will be able to see better and they will become more productive. So they turned the lighting level up, and lo and behold, people became more productive. So confirm that hypothesis. The next hypothesis was the inverse. Well, if we turn the lighting level down, people won't be able to see as well and productivity will go down. They turned the lighting levels down, but productivity continued to go up. It wasn't the physical stimulus that was contributing to productivity, but rather it was that the researchers were paying attention to the employees. They were monitoring their performance. They were talking to them about their performance. They were asking them about their wants and their needs. They were asking them why their performance was going up. They were actually being paid attention to for the very first time in that organization. It really opened Mayo and his colleagues' eyes to the idea of the social environment within an organization. That if we don't recognize that employees are human beings who have social needs and that they are working within this social environment, we can never make our organizations effective. And so the criticism, obviously, of the classical school is they completely overlooked and completely ignored the social aspect of organizational work. Not only were people working harder and being more productive because they were being paid attention to, but Mayo and his colleagues also decided to put people into work groups. And they thought if we put people into work groups, and then we'll see how their productivity increases or goes down. They found out that by putting people in groups, the group productivity actually increased. And that happened for a couple of reasons. One reason, obviously, is the group collective. That if you put people together in a group, then you have a collective of their skills and their creativity and their innovation that should exceed the skills of one individual person. But most notably, what was happening is if one member of the group was not pulling their weight, if they were not working hard enough, if they were making the rest of the group look bad, then the other members of the group would then place pressure on that person to work harder to increase their productivity to make the group look better. And so again, it just supports this idea of the social environment of the workplace. And if we don't pay attention to that social environment, don't recognize the social needs of our employees, we will never be able to achieve our goals as an organization. So what Mayo and his colleagues did is they recognized the organization as a social system. Not only are there formal elements within an organization, but there are also informal elements as well. There are informal groups that form in organizations based upon social needs. And we have to recognize that those informal groups not only exist, but those informal groups also have inherent value for the creation of effectiveness within the organization. We see a lot of Elton Mayo and human relations theory in our modern organizations. Your organization, I'm sure, probably has some type of a counseling or an EAP, an employee assistance program. Training and development programs, professional development opportunities are all artifacts of Elton Mayo and human relations theory as well. So in human relations theory, we are saying in order to be effective, we need to take into account the human element and the social element within our organizations. However, it wasn't all roses. There are people who have problems and critiques with the human relations school as well. The primary criticism of the human relations school is that, yes, we are paying attention to individual employees, but we are doing it for the benefit of the organization. That if we can pay attention to these social needs, we can make people more productive. And by making them more productive, we will then in turn make our organizations more effective. So the goal of these theories is still the organizational level of making the organization effective, as opposed to doing this for the benefit of each individual employee. And that was the primary critique that then gave rise to another school of thought, modern human resource theory. In the school of modern human resource theory, we now start to define effectiveness a little bit differently. Effectiveness is no longer defined as what's in the best interest of the organization. Effectiveness now can also be defined as what is in the best interest of our individual employees. So effectiveness can be measured by enhancing our individual employees as resources, helping our employees to develop their own skills and their own abilities, even if it means eventually they're going to take those skills and abilities and leave the organization and move on to greener pastures. So we could still define this as being effective, even if that person leaves the organization. So it's not all about the macro level of the organization. Now it's also about the micro level of the employee. And so you can kind of think about it kind of in the old, take the old JFK adage and kind of flip it around a little bit. We're not just asking the question, what can the individual do for the organization? But now we're going to ask the question, what also can the organization do for the individual? And so here in human resource management theory, one of the primary authors that really kind of gave rise to a lot of the subsequent theories in human resource management was Abraham Maslow. And I'm sure you have heard about and read about Abraham Maslow before in your studies. Any psychology classes in the past, you talked about Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. And so what Maslow tells us is that every individual employee has their own hierarchy of needs, running from, as you see on the screen, physiological needs at the bottom, things like need for food, water, warmth. Next need up is safety needs, the need to feel secure and safe. Next level up are your psychological needs, belongingness and love, esteem needs. And at the very apex of the hierarchy of needs, you have self-actualization, achieving one's full potential, essentially becoming all that you can be as a human being. The importance here is that the bottom four needs, according to Maslow, are what he calls your deficiency needs. People are motivated by a deficiency in these needs. Once that deficiency is filled, then it no longer serves as a motivator. So once you have enough food and water, you are no longer motivated by trying to acquire food and water. Once you feel secure and safe, you're no longer motivated by those safety needs, and so on and so on. The top level self-actualization is what he refers to as a growth motivator, a growth need. This never goes away. People are always motivated by their desire to grow, to self-actualize, to become all that they can be. Well, our famous so what question comes back to haunt us again. Well, so what? What does this have to do with organizational effectiveness? It is important because it tells us that as leaders and managers, we need to understand the needs of our individual employees and we need to work toward helping them satisfy those needs. And the ongoing need of self-actualization, helping our employees achieve their full potential, is one that never ends. And so to be effective as an organization, it's not all about achieving the ultimate goal of the organization. It's helping our employees achieve their goals in terms of their own self-actualization. And that's kind of the so what of Abraham Maslow with human resource management theory. Maslow is also important because he was held in very high esteem by Douglas McGregor. And Douglas McGregor is one of our human resource management theorists, wrote his book, The Human Side of the Enterprise, where he presents to us two different theories, which I know you've heard about before in some of your previous courses, Theory X and Theory Y. Theory X saying that individual employees are very lazy, that they are not very creative, that they are not very intelligent, that they don't like to work, a very dim, very negative view of human nature. Contrast that to Theory Y. Theory Y says that people are intelligent, they are creative, they seek out responsibility, they like to work, that work is as natural as leisure, a much more positive view of human nature. The problem, according to Douglas McGregor, the majority of our employees are Theory Y employees. Now, he's a realist, so he doesn't believe that everyone is Theory Y in our organizations. But he says the majority of our employees in our organizations are Theory Y employees. The problem is that they are working in Theory X organizations. So we're basically shoehorning these very creative, intelligent people, these Theory Y employees, into a classical Theory X organization. The problem with that is that when you put a Theory Y person in a Theory X organization, they are not being provided with the opportunities that they need in order to be creative and to be intelligent and to grow as human resources. So McGregor argues that the primary job of an organization is to transition itself from being Theory X to being more Theory Y to match the Theory Y employees who populate that organization. He gives us a lot of ways in which we can transform a Theory X into a Theory Y organization, and a lot of his strategies are very similar to what we read 40 years earlier from Mary Parker Follett. One of those specific strategies that he talks about is what he calls job enrichment. And in job enrichment, what we do is we allow employees to participate in the development of their own jobs, of their own position descriptions, so that they can have some input in terms of what they do on a daily basis and how they do it. They can also have input in terms of the types of skills that they want to develop and the professional development opportunities that should be afforded to them within their positions. We give them that self-determination and that self-governance that Mary Parker Follett talked about all those decades earlier. Douglas McGregor had a student by the name of Chris Argyris. And Chris Argyris took Douglas McGregor's Theory Y approach and kind of ran with it and built upon it. And according to Chris Argyris, people have a fundamental need for personal growth. That he will argue that as people mature, they go through this maturation process, this personal growth journey. And it's a natural maturation process that the vast majority of employees will go through. And as people go through this personal growth journey, the personal growth journey is a process of increasing activism. They become more active in their own self-determination. Increasing independence. They become more independent in the way in which they behave and doing their jobs on a daily basis. They develop the ability to behave in a multiplicity of different ways. They develop deepening interest. Their interests become much deeper and much less superficial than they used to be. They start to take on a much longer time perspective. So instead of just worrying about tomorrow or the next day, they're more concerned about 5, 10, 15 years down the line. They're looking at where they want to be. as a professional in 10 or 15 years. They naturally begin to aspire to superordinate positions. They aspire to these leadership positions that perhaps they didn't aspire to previously. And they start to develop a lot more self-awareness. They start to develop a lot more emotional maturity. And this is all part of this personal growth process. The problem, according to Chris Ardress, is classical organization theory inhibits this personal growth process. And it's then incumbent upon organizations, as theory-wide organizations, to help individual employees as they move their way through this personal growth journey. The importance here, obviously, is again that we now have a different way to define organizational effectiveness. It's not just about achieving the goals of the organization, it's about how well the organization is able to help employees achieve their own goals and to find their way through this personal growth process. So you can see with modern human resource management theory, we have come very far from the classical world. And we've also come far from the human relations world. In the human relations theory world, we were looking at the goals of the organization. What can we get from employees to benefit the organization? Now, effectiveness in the human resource management theory is not just about organizational goals, but helping individual employees achieve their own individual goals. So a different way that we can measure the effectiveness of an organization. But if you're looking for a commonality that kind of ties classical theory with human relations theory, with human resource management theory, I think that common tie is very much an internal focus to the organization. We didn't really kind of combine this first and second part of this class together. We didn't really combine the external and the internal environments until we get into the 1960s and 70s and 80s with the development of systems theory. So with systems theory, we're going to change our definition of effectiveness again. Now, under systems theory, our definition of effectiveness focuses on finding the proper balance between the organization and its environment. So the ultimate goal of the organization, an effective organization, is one that can find the proper balance between the organization and the environment in which that organization operates. Systems theory makes the argument that an organization is part of a larger system, and that a change in one part of the system can affect the entire system. So we look at the organization as being something that has a role to play in a larger system. We have two different approaches to systems theory that grew up over the 1960s and 70s. Those two different approaches are known as natural versus open systems. Sometimes people refer to natural systems as closed system. So natural closed system versus open systems. Natural systems theory views organizations as living organisms that are trying to survive. So the ultimate goal of an organization is agency survival. So an effective organization is an organization that has enhanced its chances for survival under natural or closed systems theory. The primary focus in natural closed systems theory is internal to the organization. So how can we best balance everything that's going on within the organization to help that organization survive into the future? So if you liken an organization to a living organism, and not to depress you too much, but from the time living organisms are born, they tend to dissipate energy into their environment. And most of the actions that that living organism will take are geared toward the survival of that organism. Same type of thing with organizations. You would assume that most of the actions they take are elemental to that agency's survival. However, in open systems theory, it's a little bit different. In that in open systems theory, we're not just looking inside the organization and looking at all the mechanisms to help the organization survive internally. But we're looking at organizational survival as the balance between the organization and its external environment. So in open systems theory, we start looking beyond the walls of the organization to measure organizational effectiveness. Now, natural and open systems theory do share some similar approaches. They both assume that these systems that we are talking about do not have a concrete existence. The systems are dynamic, systems can change over time, and systems can go out of existence over time as well. Natural and open systems theory are both oriented around creating conceptual frameworks that will help us understand how organizations operate and then how they interact with their environments. It's really very much a focus on the interdependence of the different parts of this system. Also, both natural as well as open systems theory focus on this idea of achieving an equilibrium. Both natural and open systems theory believe that the ultimate goal in organizational effectiveness is to find an equilibrium, to find a balance, what we'd refer to as a steady state. Natural systems theorists will look at that equilibrium within the organization. So with a living organism, if that living organism is healthy, if it's achieved that organizational health, it's done so through finding that balance in blood pressure. So it has a normal blood pressure, it has a normal pulse ox level, it is devoid of diseases, has normal blood sugar, all those different indicators of health. That's a balance. And then if that body is in balance, that body has a better chance of surviving longer. Well, it's the same type of thing with natural systems theory. If organizations can find that internal equilibrium, that internal balance will help that organization survive into the future, because that is their ultimate goal, is agency survival. For open systems theorists, the balance is between the organization and the external environment. But open system theorists are also looking for that equilibrium, that steady state, that balance. That point of equilibrium is what's known as a point of homeostasis. All organizations in systems theory pursue this point of homeostasis, this regulation of processes and structure that will then help it balance within its system. For natural systems theorists, the focus is internal. For open systems theorists, the focus is more with the external environment. One of our most prominent natural systems theorists is Chester Barnard. And here is another theorist that you've probably run into in past courses in the MPA program. Barnard tries to find the balance within an organization through the creation of what he calls a cooperative system. He makes the argument that in order for an organization to survive and to be effective, organizations must be able to obtain contributions from their members that will contribute to the effectiveness of the organization. So the job of a leader or manager is to extract the contributions from employees in order to make the organization achieve its goals. Now, there are a lot of contributions that employees can provide to their organizations. And we'll talk more about this in a couple of sessions when we get into the importance of motivational theories for organizational effectiveness. But employees provide a lot of contributions. They provide their effort. They provide their loyalty. They provide their knowledge and their skills and their abilities. Those are all contributions that they are providing to the organization. Those are contributions that effective managers and leaders must extract from their employees. And the way in which they extract them from their employees is by providing them with incentives. So the goal of the organization, the goal of leaders and managers, is to provide the right set of incentives to then induce employees to then contribute this amount of effort, these skills to the organization to help the organization achieve its goals. So for Barnard, the balance here is to balance those incentives, those rewards we're giving to employees with the contributions that we are getting from those employees. If we're providing too many rewards and not getting enough contributions, then obviously we are not going to be effective as an organization. If we are providing too few rewards, but still getting more contributions, then that's going to lead us to employee dissatisfaction. So for Barnard, efficiency is defined as if the contributions we are getting exceed the net dissatisfaction of our employees, we are operating efficiently as an organization. If we are achieving organizational goals, that is our indicator of organizational effectiveness. So we have to try and find the right balance. Now, Barnard will recognize that balance that we are looking for, that equilibrium we're looking for between contributions and incentives, that equilibrium is going to differ between different employees. He presents to us this thing he refers to as a zone of indifference. Says that every employee has their own different zone of indifference. If you ask an employee to provide a contribution and what you're asking them to do violates their morals, it violates their norms, their ethical standards, they are going to refuse to give those contributions. They are going to push back on that request. You have violated their zone of indifference. So the goal of leaders and managers to strike this equilibrium is to operate within the zone of indifference of each employee by not violating their ethical and moral standards. If you operate within their zone of indifference, you do not violate their ethical or moral standards, you are more likely to get contributions that you need from those employees. Well, so what? The so what here is Barnard's telling us every employee has a different zone of indifference. So it's important for us to know our employees, to know what types of incentives they value, and to know what types of contributions we need to get from each one of those individual employees. So according to Barnard, the functions of an executive, the functions of a leader or a manager, is you develop a system of communication with your employees so you can know what they place a value upon, so you know what rewards and inducements to provide them with, then provide the right set of inducements to employees to then get the contributions from them that will then allow you to achieve the goals of the organization. Now, a lot of people have problems with Chester Barnard and his approach to natural systems theory. A lot of these criticisms are the same ones that we saw lodged against human relations theorists. People would say that Barnard accepts as unquestioned this hierarchical authority of the classical theorists, that he accepts as unquestioned that leaders have the ability to essentially exploit their employees to get the contributions that they need to make the organization effective and to help it achieve its goals. It's a relatively anti-democratic way of looking at organizations. So that's kind of natural systems theory. We're trying to strive for agency survival, and we're doing it by finding this balance between incentives and contributions from our employees. Another author that really serves as a nice kind of segue or transition from the natural approach to the open systems approach is this person by the name of Robert Merton. And Merton developed what he called his middle range theories. Merton questioned natural theory. He questioned this analogy of a living organism. He did not think that organizations were like living organisms. And the reason for that, he said, not every activity that an organization does is important for its goals. Not every activity an organization engages in ensures that agency's survival. And not every activity that organization engages in is indispensable for the survival of the organization. So Merton kind of shifts our definition of effectiveness away from agency survival and focuses it more to the consequences of agency actions. Merton argues that what we need to look at instead of agency survival is we need to look at the outcomes, the consequences of our goods and services for those clients and those consumers who are consuming those goods and services. That those consumers need to receive a net positive from those goods and services that we are creating. So now under Merton, in his functional theory, effectiveness is now being defined as the outcomes that are being experienced by our constituents. So are we providing the goods and services that are meeting the wants and the needs of those beneficiaries, of those consumers of our products and our services? Merton says one of the problems we have in our organizations is we lose sight of those consequences for our consumers. We lose sight of how well we are meeting the needs of the people we are supposed to be serving. And instead, in organizations, he argues, we have a lot of overconformity, whereby organizations will focus more on the rules and regulations that they developed under classical theory, as opposed to focusing on what your consumers need. This ends up with what we call goal displacement. We're focusing more on rules than what we're trying to benefit, how we're trying to benefit our consumers. And it also results in institutional rigidity. The more rules and regulations and policies that an organization develops, the more likely is that organization will define effectiveness as meeting those rules, as opposed to defining effectiveness as benefiting their consumers. This institutional rigidity then creates a lot of conflict between bureaucrats and members of the public, because members of the public do not feel that their wants and needs are being met by the organization. But again, the important thing about Robert Merton is that Merton is kind of taking us away from the natural systems definition of organizations as living organisms and kind of taking us beyond just focusing on the internal balance within the organization and organizational survival. It's a really nice segue then into open systems theory. And the reason why it's a good segue is that when you start focusing on your consumers and your beneficiaries, where are those consumers located? They're located outside the walls of the organization. They are located in the external environment. So what Merton has done is he's pushed us more to focus outside of the organization through something like open systems theory. So open systems theory looks at the relationship between the organization and its external environment. And it kind of changes up some of the assumptions that we had under natural systems theory. So when natural systems theory viewed organizations as living organisms, it made the assumption that from the moment an organization is created, that organization begins to decay, that organization begins to dissipate energy out into its environment until it gets to the point in time where it no longer has the resources it needs to survive, and it will then go out of existence. And that's why we have organizations going out of existence. However, then that whole process of dissipating energy out into the environment is a process from the natural sciences known as entropy. The entropy is you're always going to, as an organization, deteriorate. You're going to lose energy out into the environment until you end up going out of existence. That's the process of entropy. Open systems theorists will argue that there's a process known as negative entropy. And then not only do organizations dissipate energy into their environment, but they have the ability to import new energy into the organization. They can import new resources. Getting us back to the first slide we covered tonight with capacity, they can import money. They can import political support. They can import a qualified and competent labor pool. Those are all resources that organizations can bring into the organization that will then help that organization survive into the future. So the balance here, the equilibrium, is an equilibrium between the organization and its environment. Open systems theorists will tell us that there are multiple ways that organizations can find that balance between the organization and its external environment. The reason that the fact that there are multiple ways to do it, there are multiple paths to find this equilibrium point, that is a concept that's known as equifinality, which is kind of your 25-cent word of the night, equifinality. So if you're going to play Scrabble, you have those letters, you can spell it equifinality. Equifinality says that there are multiple different ways that organizations can find this balance, this equilibrium between the organization and its external environment. So it gives us a lot to study in organizations because there are so many ways that organizations can interact with their external environments. But here the definition of effectiveness has changed, and that the definition of effectiveness now includes the relationships between the organization and its external environment. And we can now define effectiveness as how well the organization is importing resources from its external environment. That, as we'll see probably next time, will be the model of effectiveness known as the systems resource model. That you are being effective as an organization if you are importing the right type and the right amount of resources into the organization. Two primary authors that are best known for open systems theory, Katz and Kahn, and you may have read them in the past. Well, how about some other theories that can contribute to our understanding of organizational effectiveness? One theory that you may have run into or not before in organization theory is a theory known as socio-technical theory. Socio-technical theory is a very simple theory that tells us effectiveness in organizations is created by the combination of social aspects and technical aspects of the organization. So if we can find a way to find that nexus between the social system within our organization and the technical activities that we are doing, by combining the nexus and finding that nexus between the social part of the organization and the technical aspect of the organization, that's how we will make our organizations effective. Another theory is known as structural contingency theory. And as you might guess, this is one of my favorite theories because it is your it depends theory. Structural contingency theory says that there is no one best way to structure your organization for effectiveness. That in order to determine how to structure your organization for effectiveness, you must take into account several different characteristics. You have to take into account the context of the situation. Things such as environmental uncertainty. If you have a lot of uncertainty in the external environment, you're going to need to have an organization that is structured in a much more nimble type of fashion, an organization that can adapt very quickly and very readily to a lot of those changes and a lot of that uncertainty in the external environment. Technology. The types of technology that are being used by the organization will also have an impact upon structure. If you are using some very sophisticated types of technology, then you're going to have some folks working in your organization who are adept at using that very sophisticated technology. It may make it a little bit difficult for you to have the traditional structure of organizational structure of the classical theorists, because perhaps managers don't have the technical expertise necessary to then supervise and oversee those employees who are doing these very technical types of activities. Also, in terms of technology, if you have quickly changing technology, it means, again, you're going to be very adaptive and very responsive to your environment. The size of the organization will have an impact upon how you structure it as well. Large organizations, it's going to be difficult to have them be those flat democratic organizations. You're probably going to be much more along the lines of a more regimented type of organizational structure. Strategy obviously will have an impact upon how you structure your organization for effectiveness. Resource dependency, how dependent you are upon resources in your environment, will also have an impact. If you are 100% dependent upon grants as a nonprofit organization, then you're probably going to behave a lot differently than if you're 100% dependent upon governmental appropriations. And then obviously public accountability. How transparent and how open does your decision-making process need to be to public scrutiny? That will obviously have an impact upon your structure as well. It's going to be difficult for you to have a very opaque type of structure where you don't have a whole lot of transparency and communication with your public. That's going to be difficult if the types of things you are doing are very important to the public, and the public will hold you accountable to having a lot of openness and transparency. The real importance of this idea of a structural contingency approach to organizational effectiveness is it really is the end of the one best way to structure an organization. We realize there is no magic bullet. like we had under the classical school. It really will depend upon the contingency in which an organization finds itself. And just to kind of move this along a little bit more quickly for y'all, one of the organization theories I think is probably most instructive for us in measuring the effectiveness of an organization is the School of Organization Culture. And if you haven't been exposed to the School of Organization Culture before, I think culture is one of the primary determinants of how we measure effectiveness in an organization. The idea here with organization culture, every organization has its own unique culture. It has its own set of norms and values and behaviors for expectation. Since every organization has its own unique culture, in order to define and measure organizational effectiveness, we must first understand the culture of that organization. Now, there are three different levels to an organization's culture. At the very superficial level, we have what are called artifacts. Those are your visible organization structures, things like agendas, things like minutes from meetings. Those we call our artifacts. Those are very easy to see. They're very easy to discover. It's very similar to in the world of archaeology. If you go on an archaeological dig, so you can learn more about an ancient society, you'll dig up artifacts. You'll dig up eating utensils. That will give you some idea of how that society behaved on an everyday type of basis. Same type of thing in an organization, these artifacts, these agendas, these meeting notes, these policy and procedure manuals, these are very visible, they're very easy to access. At a more hidden level, you have your espoused values. It's not really hidden, but these are values that the organization will tell you they have. So these are things like their mission statement, like we'll talk about on Thursday, their official and their operative goals, which we'll also talk about on Thursday. These are things the organization will state to you, this is who we are, this is what we are trying to achieve. Then at your hidden level, you have what are called basic assumptions. These basic assumptions are the values and the expectations that everyone shares in the organization, but we don't talk about a lot. We don't go out there and talk about, we expect that everyone's going to be treated in a civil manner. We're going to treat everyone in a civil and collegial manner. Unless we have a civility code, we're probably not going to write that down anywhere, but we all assume that everyone is going to be treated in this civil, this collegial type of manner. Basic assumptions are the most difficult level of organization culture to see because we don't talk about them. They're just assumptions that everyone shares as members of the organization. So in order to understand the organization and how the organization defines effectiveness, we need to understand the unique culture within that organization. Now, when leaders come into organizations, they have a variety of different strategies that they can use in order to embed culture into an organization. So there are primary and secondary embedding mechanisms. So things such as a new leader may come into an organization and they may bring with them a slogan that they think epitomizes the culture of the organization. And that slogan may then appear on everyone's stationery and everyone's business card. And every time you see the name of the organization, that slogan, that motto is attached right underneath the name of the organization. That's a way to then try and embed culture into that organization. Leaders can also embed culture into an organization by paying attention to certain things. So the types of things that they reward, the types of things that they recognize versus the types of things that they penalize, that can really serve as a good indicator to employees about what is valued by this organization. So there are a lot of ways leaders can put cultures into organizations, but to truly understand organizations and how they are going to define effectiveness, we have to understand the culture. We have to understand the norms, the operating standards, the expectations, the beliefs of the members of that organization to better understand what that organization considers to be effective. So what are some of the trends that we have seen? Again, we didn't go through obviously all the different schools of thought. I don't want this to be an organization theory class, but we looked at some of the primary schools like the classical school, human relations, human resource management, the system school, and then some of the newer schools like structural contingencies, social, technical, and organization culture. But we look at the evolution of our understanding of organizations and organizational effectiveness. What do we see? What are the major trends that come out of that examination? One primary trend we see is that we incorporate more of a consideration of the external environment. That's not all just about the internal environment like it was in the classical school. Now we are looking at the external environment and the role that the organization plays in its larger external environment. So just managing resources effectively in the organization may not be a good enough definition of effectiveness. Now we may need to look at how the organization interacts with its larger system, its larger external environment. Another trend that comes out of our examination of the literature is a recognition of the contextual nature of organizational effectiveness. That effectiveness, the definition of effectiveness, will differ depending upon organizations. It'll depend upon all these different contingencies in the organization we talked about. It'll depend upon how democratic that organization is. It'll depend upon the culture of that organization. So it's very much an it depends type of an approach in terms of the contextual nature of organizational effectiveness. Also, from our understanding of organizations, we have developed a recognition of the multiplicity of the determinants of effectiveness, that there is more than one way to measure effectiveness. It's not just, did we achieve our organization's goals? Maybe it's also about, did we develop the right amount and the right types of surplus of resources for our organization from our external environment? Maybe it's looking at how we treat our employees and how happy and satisfied our employees are with how they're being treated by the organization. Maybe it could be a measure of how satisfied our consumers are, our beneficiaries, in terms of the consequences they are getting from the services that we are providing. So there are multiple different ways in which we can define effectiveness. But overall, what we have learned from 150 years of literature is that there is no one best way to make our organizations effective. We have to take into account the multiplicity of determinants. We have to take into account the multiplicity of different contexts in which our organizations operate in order to determine effectiveness. So it becomes a very messy and a very complex job that we have before us in trying to determine the effectiveness of an organization. And how you define effectiveness for your organization will obviously be different than how one of your colleagues may define effectiveness for their organization. Now, I know this has been a lot of me talking tonight. I know that's kind of different when we are in this virtual environment. It's a little bit more difficult for us to have communication and discussion. So since we are going to be back together on Thursday evening on campus, I thought we could go ahead and save our breakout groups on this topic until Thursday. So when we get together on Thursday, what we will do is we'll start out with our normal breakout group type of an approach. And for those groups, we will be looking at this idea of the environmental influence on organizational effectiveness. And I'll have each group in discussions among members of the group talk about, what aspects of the external environment impact effectiveness of the organization, what aspects of the internal environment have an impact upon effectiveness. So we can kind of see how all of our different organizations, how they differ in terms of both their external as well as internal environments. So we'll start with that when we get together on Thursday. Then on Thursday, when we're done with those breakout groups, then we'll get into a discussion of missions and goals and strategic planning and talk about the impact of those on organizational effectiveness. If time remains at the end of class on Thursday, then we might do some more breakout groups looking at missions and values and goals, and then kind of wrap up the session with that on Thursday. I doubt we will have time to get into our models of effectiveness, and so we'll probably have to wait for that until we get together in our next session. So Thursday, we are on campus. Then the following week, we are on campus again. And then our next week, we will have our second Zoom session on August 6th. And then we will have another on-campus session on August 8th. We'll see if we wrap up everything by August 8th. If we do, then that final session on August 15th, we will just reserve that for you to finish up your final assignment for the class, your chosen solution paper, and we will then call it a day. So that is all I have for you tonight. I'm sorry I didn't give you a break tonight, but I knew if we didn't take a break, I could get you out of here within 2.5 hours. So are there any observations or comments or anything at all about either this information or about the paper that's coming due on Thursday? I think it's probably safe now for connectivity issues. I can turn my camera on again. So if not, then we'll call it a night. If you have any questions at all between now and Thursday, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, I'll see you back on campus at 6 o'clock on Thursday, and we'll get started with this breakout group assignment. Okay? Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening, and I'll see you on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.